Welcome to the Governance Podcast here at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name's Mark Pennington and I'm the Director of the Centre. I'm very pleased to have with me today Professor Deirdre McCloskey. Deirdre is Distinguished Fellow and holder of the Isaiah Berlin Chair in Liberal Thought at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And she's also a Distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics and of History and Professor Emerita of English and of Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the author of many books, the most recent of which is Bettering Humanomics, a New and Old Approach to Economic Science, which is published by the University of Chicago Press. Deirdre, it's very good to have you with us here today.
Well, I'm extremely pleased to be here. I'm only sorry that it didn't overlap with the Queen's Jubilee and the New Zealand Test match.
Right. Well, that's next weekend, I believe. So,
yeah,
or certainly the Jubilee is.
Yeah.
And we're going to be in the middle of what purports to be one of the biggest national rail strikes for 50 years over that period. So it could be quite interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder if we could start off just by talking about this new book, Bettering Humanomics, and think about this theme of humanomics that you address there.
Yeah.
So my sense in reading the book is that you really have two themes. One is thinking about what might be the best way to defend, broadly speaking, a liberal order of society.
Yes.
Based on open markets or what you refer to as trade-tested betterment.
Yeah.
And connecting that with debates in essentially the methodology of social science or the methodology of economics in particular. Yeah. So your argument seems to be that the kind of economics that people practice is both inaccurate in many ways, but also that it lacks a kind of capacity to inspire people to believe in a liberal order. And the liberal order at the moment seems to be under threat from multiple directions.
Oh, yes.
So I wonder if we could start by thinking about what are the threats to the liberal order as you see them, and then sort of try to work through how the role of ideas relate to that.
Well, the obvious threats are Putin in Ukraine, and I think the advantage of the astounding success of the Ukrainians is that it's made clear, even to people who are not paying attention to politics or certainly not high political theory, that the issue is not really left or right. It's a liberal society versus a tyranny. But the threats are myriad, as you point out. In my own country, I don't need to remind people after the horrible shooting in shootings, because now it gets to be every week in Buffalo and in Texas, that that there's a threat from the right. Although again, it's not the right; it's populism more than anything else. It's the idea that a man on the white horse will make the nation great. Again. But of course, there are threats to liberalism from the left as well. We're founding, Neil Ferguson, other people and I are founding a new university in Texas, indeed, in Austin, called the University of Austin, that tries to make a space where people can talk free of the threats from both the left and the right to sweet talk, as I call it. And I think we need more sweet talk. We need to get back to real liberalism. But the problem is that the programs isn't quite the word, but the attitudes that the men and women on the white horses bring are more inspiring. I was once myself a socialist, and I know more socialist songs than my socialist friends. sort of voluntary slavery has an appeal to people. They came from families which are socialist enterprises, or authoritarian enterprises, and it was comfortable to be a child. So we people who believe in non-slave societies need to inspire people again. It happened once, so maybe we can do it again.
But could you say a little bit about how you think that sort of inspirational model, if you like, or way of talking about liberalism, how has that been lost? Is it that people in positions of political authority who are partly informed by people from universities have become taken over by a sort of technocratic mindset?
Yes.
Or is it something else? What's the process which has meant that liberalism has become uninspiring to people?
There are two sides of the non-liberal coin. One is the decision by economists and calculators, as Burke expressed it, to banish ethical, and persuasive, emotionally persuasive talk from their enterprises. Excuse me. Became solid in economics in the 1930s. So the economists claim, Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman claim to be doing positive economics. We're just scientists here. Don't worry, there's no ethical matter here. We're not preaching. Even my friend James Buchanan, though he preached all the time, was hostile to preaching. And on the other hand, more widely, Marx still lives. And it's thought to be nice to poor people to treat them as children instead of allowing them to have jobs. And I'm quite shocked, by the way, here in London for a few days, of how many people I see sleeping rough. See, it's even more than in Chicago, and it's appalling that these. It's not that they can't find jobs. It's that that the social safety net, as people conceive it, organized by the state, has made employment and housing much harder to get.
Well, it's funny you say that, because the situation here at the moment is very, in some ways, it's quite odd, because the official unemployment rate
it's very low.
It's actually very low. It's like 3.2%.
Sure, as in the United States.
The lowest it's been in a very long time.
Yep.
However, there are very large numbers of people who've actually left the workforce.
Yep.
Partly after COVID. I mean, it's like there are millions of people, and quite a lot on what are called out of work benefits.
Yeah, it's the same in the States.
Now, the people that you see on the street, and I agree that is very shocking. I'm not sure what the situation is there, whether those are people who are on benefits or whether they are outside of the system.
I don't think they're on benefits at all.
Yeah.
I think they have various kinds of problems that have excluded them from ordinary unemployment insurance, which you've had since 1911.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly the same in the United States. They're not exactly the same, but it's.
But if we take that issue, so if you talk about how shocking this is to see, the gut reaction of many people would be that capitalism is failing to provide for these people.
Yeah, and I would say that it's something like the opposite. I venture, now this is a speculation, I'm an economic historian, I haven't done the homework on this, so I'm not sure of it. But I would venture to say that there are more people sleeping rough in London now as a percentage of the population than there were in 1900. And the reason is that housing has become vastly more expensive relative to anything. From urban planning, which is supposed to help people but ends up hurting them.
Well, it's funny you say that because, I mean, I've been intrigued. We've had these arguments in the last week about the government introducing a windfall tax on energy companies. And part of the argument for that is the companies have done nothing to deserve the accidental circumstances which have caused a shortage in oil and gas and have driven up the price. But you could apply the same logic to people's houses. The value of people's houses has quadrupled in the last 20 years, not because of anything they've done, but because of the restriction in supply. When people try to increase supply, many people object to that on various environmental grounds or other sorts of grounds. So there's an interesting sort of mismatch there in the way that people see those issues.
Oh, I was on a panel at the National Theatre a few years ago, and the audience was mainly left wing. I could tell by the pattern of applause, and I was not the most right wing, and I don't consider myself right wing. I'm liberal, and I'm not on the spectrum, but I'm classified as right wing. And when I said the housing crisis in England, and most particularly in London, is caused by planning permission, they hissed. And I knew that this inconsistent idea that you can cut the supply of housing, yet nonetheless somehow provide for the poor, was operating in their minds.
Well, there are two things that have happened. I mean, there has been significant immigration, so you have lots of people coming in.
You bet.
But even before the immigration, this pattern of rising prices, and this is something I looked at in my PhD thesis. Actually, it's been going on since the 1950s.
Sure, it has. I have a friend who teaches at the LSE. He has a house in St. Albans that he bought in 1967, I believe. And he said he could now, with the channel, he could live in the north of France on a farm and commute to the school to teach every once in a while on the capital gain in St. Albans. St. Albans is not that close to London.
But let's pursue this though. So if we think about that issue, how do you address the housing crisis? And relate it to this debate about how economics is communicated. Some people might argue that in order to explain to people the nature of that crisis, they do need to be able to understand sort of supply and demand, the impact that controls and regulations might have, perhaps in quite a technical way.
Well,
is that right, or is there another way of?
No, it's not right, and it's too hard. Look, I'm not a natural economist. I've been an economist since I was a second-year student at university at Harvard College. I love economics, and I practice it. Isn't that wonderful? But it took me years to understand as simple a thing as that prices, according to economists, and they're correct, are matters of efficiency, not of justice. That is that the wonderful sainted nun of your acquaintance pays the same for milk as you do is not just, I suppose, although I suppose it is too, but you might think it's not just. But if you don't do it, the supply of milk is grossly distorted and goes to the wrong people. So, no, it's too hard. And you can see it's too hard from the amazing popular success of books like Thomas
Piketty.
Thomas Piketty on inequality, or Mariana Mazzucato on industrial planning, and then she has a second book on on how we ought to pay for the overhead of the society. And as I've said about Piketty in a recent review in the TLS, it's based on extremely bad technical economics. But that doesn't matter. It appeals. So the appeal of liberalism has to be through artists, through rock musicians, through filmmakers, through the people that you and I as academics might influence, but they're the ones who tell the stories, and it's through stories. Stories like the occasional Hollywood product in praise of entrepreneurship and supply and demand. More commonly, the corporate executives in Hollywood produce movies attacking corporate executives.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of Marxoid, I'd call it, atmosphere that, aren't you in favor of helping the poor? Aren't you a terrible person if you don't agree with statism? And again, it's this model of the household. In a famous speech in 1928 in the Swedish Parliament, a Swedish politician expressed the ideal of Sweden becoming a national home with Alva and Gunnar in charge, in Stockholm.
Okay, so what you're saying is you need a sort of countervision, a sort of counter set of images, or rhetorics, or
That's right.
plays or productions.
Yep.
That strikes me as being a very long-term project.
It is.
And does it hold out any hope for the immediate future if we have to wait that long for?
Well, the truth is that most people accede to voluntary trade in their ordinary lives. They get indignant when the price of what we Americans call gas, and you can stop and get gas with your food in the United States, or when their rent goes up or something. And then they start using these, what I'm calling Marxoid complaints that the working class is being exploited. But for the most part, when they buy a Cadbury's whole nut, and I tell you, they make an imitation of whole nut in the United States, and it tastes nothing like the one here. So I've been gobbling Cadbury's whole nut here. They don't object; they find it fine. And when they get paid for their services, they say, "Yeah, that's good. I deserve this." So that basic non-statist assumption is strong, and it's I think it's especially, well, it's a mixed bag, but it's especially strong in Britain and the United States. In France, it's not so obvious.
I wonder if I could explore what I think is at least because of the events of the last couple of years, but maybe it goes back further than that. That I think there might be a bit of a tension there, or at least what I'm seeing in the culture, and that is what you're suggesting is that, in a sense, a kind of ideological messaging is what's really important.
Yes.
And you're suggesting that some of the opponents of liberalism who have been successful have that messaging, which is inspiring.
Yes.
But one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is this suggestion that we ought to follow science on things. We've certainly seen this in terms of the response to the pandemic. And in a number of spheres of life, people will say, you're being ideological. You are not pursuing the science.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you're saying people respond to mission statements and ideological visions, but on the other, there seems to also be this demand in the public culture to know, what does the science say?
Yeah.
How do you square those things?
Well, the Harry Collins, the great sociologist of science here at Cardiff, and I are in the midst of a paper on exactly this issue. Is there a scientific truth that we need to pay attention to? And I think there is in science, in economic science, and historical science, and biological science, and so forth. But it's not truth with a capital T. It's not such as will be revealed, as an Anglican like me thinks, at the second coming. It's provisional and revisable, and certainly in the COVID-19 epidemic, the revisions have been as striking as in contrast to the calls to follow the science, because the science keeps wobbling a bit. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to it, but it does mean that it's not a knockdown argument. And the problem is to explain, as we were saying before, the problem is to explain technicalities of epidemiology or of economics. And it's just too hard. It's too hard for people to understand uncertainties in modeling in both epidemiology and economics. It was hard for me. It's hard for them. And I'm a PhD. I have a PhD in economics, so I can understand them, but it's hard to explain. So we need to not dismantle science, or to think, oh well, it's just a bunch of toffs at universities and they don't actually know anything. There's an awful lot of talk like that. For example, when the Queen complained to the LSE economists back in about 2008-9 that they hadn't predicted the great recession then, she was just completely misunderstanding what economists can do. They can't predict the future, although they're constantly being asked to do exactly that.
Well, that's an interesting point, because again, there seems to be another tension. If you think of certainly the public discussion in the UK, but I think this has been true in the United States as well over the last 5 to 10 years. There's a minister in the current government, Michael Gove, who was scolded by a lot of people for saying people have had enough of experts. This was prior to the Brexit referendum vote. But at the same time, there also seems to be, if you like, as well as we have this kind of populist suspicion of experts, you also have a populist demand for experts. There seems to be a lot of people out there who think that, oh, well, surely the experts know what the science tells us, whether it's about economic problems or public health problems or any other problem. And the idea that there might be complexity that we don't know isn't something people want to recognize.
They don't want to hear it. There's populist simplifications on both sides, but that's not fresh news about politics. So it has always been. The abandonment of the Corn Laws in the 1840s, as the Duke said, the damned rotten potatoes, was not. It had rational scientific elements to it, the rise of economics, but it was also an appeal to emotions of various kinds, and this is the way. And as you're pointing out, they're contradictory. But do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. And if the self is the great British public, it's completely unsurprising that there are contrary even in the same mind, contradictory images. A desire to, an admirable desire to help the poor, combined with a belief in supposedly factual or scientific propositions, such as that you can have a high minimum wage and that'll help the poor, that actually hurt the poor, or have protection of British industry. Alas, our own president is a great improvement on the previous one, is also a protectionist, the way Donald Trump was.
Yeah. I wonder if we could just sort of connect this back to the themes of the book and think about the role of economists here.
Yeah.
So obviously you would want to have, I think, in a sense, a larger role for economists in public life and debate, provided they're communicating in a different way.
Well, it's not just communication. It's that they have to read.
Yeah.
And they don't. Economists were once well-read intellectuals, and now they're not. They're specialists, and they feel perfectly justified in not reading any books. Your office, or this is someone else's. It's your office, because I see my own books up there, is filled with books. And they're not just about economics. They're about politics and history and ethics and various other things, and philosophy. That's how economists once were. And then, really, since the war, they've become extremely narrow. And it's been so they, as I said, they've made this crazy decision that ethics has nothing to do with economics, which is insane. And the blessed Adam Smith, au contraire, you believe very strongly that the economy and ethics were together. So that's why I call it a new and old way of thinking about economics, because John Stuart Mill and Alfred Marshall and Adam Smith, and for that matter, John Maynard Keynes, viewed economics as part of a larger conversation about what a society should be and how people should act and what a human life is. And that's all been dropped.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because even in what strikes me at the moment, it's certainly in this country, I don't know what it's like in the United States, but here it's very striking, is that we're in the middle of an inflation crisis potentially.
Yeah.
And yet, if you listen to the public media, economists' voices actually are surprisingly absent.
Yeah.
There are very few actual economists who seem to be equipped to even speak about inflation. Yeah. Is that because there's only a very small number of people who are actually specialized in monetary theory or what have you? Or is it more a sort of general reflection that the way that economics is moved, it's actually quite far removed from practical policy type questions that actually affect the day-to-day way that people live their lives?
Well, I think it's true. It's true of both. There's been a specialization in macro, which would have puzzled Keynes, for example, and certainly Marshall. And then too, there's an increasing technical burden of macroeconomics, which has become almost insanely so. I have there's this great raising of the mathematical ante to be in this game, which is foolish. It's not necessary to know a lot of real analysis, as it's called, to be an economist, and yet all economists are trained in it. And so it's becoming as you suggest, more and more. How many angels dance on the head of a pin? Are you a big Indian or a small Indian, as Swift put it, in cracking your hard-boiled egg? So, but there's a third thing, which is that the current inflation is somewhat puzzling. Mm-hmm. There was an enormous increase, we monetarists note, in the liquidity of the world economy for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the balances, the retained earnings of corporations these days are stunning. There they sit with billions in their bank account, and yet, consumer credit is very large. And you'd think, my word, there should have been already an inflation, but there wasn't. Now, partly it's because we monetarists, I guess I call myself, made a big mistake, which I realized a long time ago, so I'm a smarter monetarist, that it's only true worldwide, not country by country. And my colleagues in macro keep talking about country by country macro as though that's the world we're in, as though it were 1955 or something, with import controls and investment controls and all kinds of things, making walls around economies.
So a lot of the money that's been produced has actually gone all over the place.
It's gone all over the place. It's gone into Chinese bank accounts in particular. So I think there's a coherent explanation for it. I'm made very uneasy by this claim that it's supply restrictions and so on. I find that, well, in a way, it's not macroeconomics, it's micro. It's about supply restrictions are about relative prices, not about prices in general. So you can see that I'm somewhat confused about it.
Yeah.
And so are all my colleagues. So wisely they shut up.
But it is striking to me how, if you listen to the media, very few economists will be debating.
I know what you mean.
For example, monetarism, in the way that they were in the 1970s.
In the 1970s,
you actually had a popular discussion about that,
exactly.
Which, it wasn't at the very technical level, but it was a discernible debate about
both Paul Samuelson on the Keynesian side and my former colleague Milton Friedman on the monetarist side had columns in the very popular magazine Newsweek. And every 2 weeks, they would, I think it was every two, they'd trade doing columns. So there was, it may be that there's not a Milton Friedman or a Paul Samuelson out there. I mean, Paul Krugman and a few others try to do that, but I don't know. It's not. I think there was more faith in the predictive powers of economists then, and maybe less after the experience of the last 10 years. I don't know. One could find out by public opinion survey.
Okay, let's move on. I wonder if we could go to one of your arguments in this book, which sort of connects to one of the big themes of your work actually over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so. And that's the role of institutions. So in this book, and also in the Bourgeois trilogy, you're very critical of what you call the Northian new institutionalist view.
And even more so in a book which is supposed to be out by now.
That should be coming out.
Another volume in this, also from the University of Chicago Press.
Well, we'll look forward to, maybe we could do a podcast on that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But you're very critical of this idea that the sort of rational choice, if you like, explanation of what institutions do, which in brief the argument is if you have institutions that are incentive compatible, where people know that they can keep the gains from any commercial activity that they're engaged in, then you will have economic growth. And your argument is no, for institutions to function well, they actually need a surrounding set of ideas, which actually legitimize things like entrepreneurial action. And what I wanted to ask you is, some critics would say, this isn't a view I endorse, but I understand where people are coming from. Some critics might say that you're going down the route of a purely sort of subjectivist explanation of things. So, is it simply a matter of what people think in terms of whether an institution works, or do institutions have some kind of real existence that actually makes a difference in your account?
They have real existence. There's a central criminal court in London, which I walked past yesterday on my way to St. Paul's. And if the judge puts on the black cap, as in the old days, your goose is cooked. So these things have real effects. Of course they do. But they're well functioning as against their nominal functioning. Depends every time on ideas, ethics, ideology. You can give some tyrannical country all the lawyers in the country, white wigs and silk even, gowns, but you won't get English law. With all its imperfections, you won't get it. You can build a parliament, as in Russia right now. You can have a parliament, but if the parliament is run by thugs and there's a grand thug in charge, it doesn't work. This is a point that Tocqueville made, and that many other people have made. That it's the spirit, the moule in French, that are. It's not just that they're necessary; they're often sufficient. You can have very crummy institutions or none, as in Hong Kong after the war. In 1947, Hong Kong and the so-called mainland were at the same appalling $1 or $2 a day income. Now Hong Kong's income is almost as high as that of the United States. And that wasn't because there were all kinds of British institutions laid on. There were a few courts and English-trained judges. And then the Hong Kongians made their own law. Most business doesn't depend on law. It depends on leaving people alone to make as reasonably ethical people, or at least people who see that if they cheat all the time, they're not going to stay in business. There's this great intermediate area of what Hayek called spontaneous order, that in most other of our activities, except the economy, everyone agrees is enormously important. Language. Here we are speaking English. There's no central planning. There's no planned, designed institution of English. And yet, surprise, surprise, here it is. The same is true of friendship. Xi Jinping would like to regulate the friendship of his subjects, but we don't do it in most countries. Music, science, art, painting has no central planner and it has institutions, the Tate or something, that's nice, or the St. Martin's in the Field orchestra, if that's what you call it. Yeah, but music and painting would evolve whether or not those institutions existed. And if there's a strong enough ethic of so-called progress in art or music, I happen to think there's Mozart and Manet are about the top of the pops, but that's a separate opinion. The arts and sciences will evolve.
The reason I asked this is actually connecting to the issue that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. So I'm thinking here about if you like, the enemies of liberalism, as you would understand it. The people who talk about the importance of a mission commitment from the state or from other entities.
Yeah, from the state is the problem.
And I think some of them seem to be giving the idea that if only people believed in the mission commitment of the state, or if only people believed in socialism, then it would actually work.
Well, that's the old argument under communism of the nature of man under socialism. And it's been tried. It's not as if, as young people are always saying these days, well, we ought to try socialism. It's not as if it hasn't been tried. We have splendid examples in Cuba and Venezuela of trying socialism. And it doesn't work. It's terrible. It impoverishes people, leaves the people ignorant. So, no, that's not the path forward. The path forward is to treat people like adults.
Yeah, but to go back to the argument there, what you're saying is it's not purely ideas in the sense that certain ideas, doesn't matter how much people believe in them.
Yeah, that's right.
They're not going to work.
That's right.
But even
that's a good point. Yeah,
institutions that are good, like what you call trade-tested betterment, are only sort of activated to have their real effect if people believe in them.
That's right. And it happened once. After Adam Smith, but not entirely because of him, after Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment, not the French Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment emphasized reason, the reason half of Enlightenment. But the Scottish Enlightenment emphasized liberty, which is the other half. And we could have done without, for a long time, the reason half of the Enlightenment, which in fact continued to develop into such horrors as Comtean positivism, and then into socialism and fascism, indeed. If you like nationalism and you like socialism, maybe you like National Socialism. That reason idea that we can build the world anew as though we knew how to build the world was a French idea. Completely unsurprisingly, the French had been exercising it for a couple of hundred years before the French Revolution. But the idea that a man's a man for all that, as Burns expressed it, that's a Scottish idea. You could say British more generally, but the closer you got to the centers of power in London, the more people believed in the power of the state. Up in Scotland, they could express skepticism. Adam Smith famously said, "The man of system believes that he can move people in a great society with the same ease as he can move pieces on a chessboard." And that statist conviction is an enemy of a free society.
So how, though, do we actually, you're saying that it's worked in the past.
It happened once.
Combination of institutions and ideas behind them to activate them.
Yeah.
Now, reading your works, it strikes me that was in many ways it was an accident.
Yeah, it was an accident.
And when things are accidental like that, how it doesn't mean we can reproduce the accident.
That's true. It happened in northwestern Europe in a tiny corner of this quarrelsome northwestern corner of the Eurasian landmass. And it could have happened in China. It could have happened in Japan or the Ottoman Empire or probably northern India.
Yeah.
But it didn't. For a series of accidents, as I explain in a long book of mine called Bourgeois Equality. Things turned out right. The Protestant Reformation, which got the idea in people's head that they could take over their own religious life and didn't have to depend on priests. That's its main effect, I think, so far as liberalism is concerned. Could have failed. If the Spanish Armada had landed on the south coast of England, the best army in Europe, England could have gone back to being Roman Catholic, and Holland then would have been surrounded, and Protestant might have failed. Had the English Civil War not happened, if Archbishop Laud had been and Charles II had been reasonable people instead of fools, the idea, as Richard Rumbold expressed it when he was being hanged in Edinburgh in 1685, would not have flourished. The idea that I think there is no man born of God above another, for no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, neither any booted and spurred to ride him. Without the American Revolution and the French Revolution, if you see what I mean, these all could have gone the other way.
Yeah. But that raises, I think, an interesting challenge. I mean, I'm thinking back to the first of these podcasts I did, which was with Barry Weingast, who would be one of the new institutions you're critical of.
He's a sweet man and a very intelligent man, and but he's a frenemy.
But he, I think, also recognizes, in some of his more recent work, that the institutions that he advocates arose by accident.
Yeah.
And I think, in a sense, the problem for his theory, for your theory, but for anyone who values liberalism, is that, in a way, this is quite a bleak view, because it means that we can't necessarily plan how liberalism might happen in the future. If it happened by accident in the past, we don't necessarily have a recipe for how we can make it happen again.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, which hasn't occurred to me. And I'm so anxious to argue against historical determinists like Marxists or on the left and conservatives on the right. That it hasn't occurred to me that an accident is precarious, but there are things we can do. Actually, do is the problem. The word "do" is the problem. Don't just stand there. Do something means you're appealing to the state, because the only "we" available for us is the state. But no, we should go on preaching, go on writing books, and hoping we can influence the country music writers and the filmmakers and the journalists. And whereas in country music we say the rubber meets the road, it's those people who we need to convince. And convince isn't the word I'd use, persuade. And but as you're suggesting, there's no guarantees even then. Because as I keep saying, slavery is attractive. People grew up as children. So another word for liberalism would be adultism. And the trouble is that a lot of people don't want to be adults. They'll say, oh yeah, I want to be adult, but then they won't want to accept the onerous responsibilities of paying child support or showing up for work or, being a responsible mother.
Okay, so Deirdre, I wonder if you could say, just to sort of round off really, what's next for you? Or do we have, you mentioned another book that's coming out after Bettering Human Economics, or is it already out? Or?
It's supposed to be out by now from the University of Chicago Press. Yeah. It's called Against Positivism or something like that. I forget the full title, but it's just Google my name.
Yeah. Okay.
You'll find it, and I'm working on a book on economic history, revisiting some work that I did as long ago as 50 years ago. I'm that old. On English agricultural history, open fields and enclosures. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through that. And then I've also got a book on theology aimed at theologians called, it's called God and Mammon, a public theology for an age of commerce. And it's attempting to persuade my progressive Christian friends, I mentioned I was an Anglican, that you don't have to be a socialist to be a follower of Jesus Christ or Muhammad or the Hindu gods. You don't have to be a statist. And then I'm going to do an autobiography. And I just got to keep scribbling.
Well, I was going to say, how do you have the time to actually produce this amount of stuff? I mean, what's a typical day in Deirdre McCloskey's life? Do you just get up and start writing, and that's it?
More or less. That's the advantage of not having any. And speaking of responsibility, not having any responsibilities to teach, which I haven't had for a while. Although in a way we're all teaching, and that's kind of my point, that we're preaching.
Yeah. And
we don't just want to preach to the converted. We want to convert some people. I'm having some success, and so are you, Mark, in persuading some young people, a good many young people, to think seriously. I have a column I've just started, for example, in the largest newspaper in Brazil that's translated into Portuguese. And there's a surprisingly large number of young student age people in Brazil, kids in Brazil, who are open to these arguments because they've experienced populism and fascism and socialism in their own lifetimes.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to reading the new books in the way I've enjoyed reading the current one, Bettering Human Economics, and the Bourgeois trilogy. So thank you very much, Deirdre, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. I come to London every chance I get. A woman who's tired of London is tired of life.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.